Airport staff kicked Maira Norris out, but regretted it when her father, Chuck Norris, arrived. A girl was accused of drug trafficking for looking out of place in business class. The staff pushed too far until she called her father. What they didn't expect was Chuck Norris. The voice was lazy, dismissive. "Your ticket, sweetheart? Or you borrowing it from someone who actually flies business class?" Tina, her name tag crooked on a faded airport vest, looked Maira up and down without hiding her smirk. Maira handed over her boarding pass and ID, calm as ever. She'd been through worse, but this felt different. Tina didn't just doubt her, she looked amused. Then Tina leaned in, eyes narrowing on the ID. "Oh, would you look at that," she chuckled. "Maira Norris, huh?" Maira nodded. "Yes." "Let me guess," Tina said, drawing out the words like a joke, "you're going to some kind of karate thing?" "Martial arts camp," Maira answered evenly. "In Chicago." Tina snorted. "And your daddy signed you up for that, huh?" "What, you think he's Chuck Norris or something?" "He is," Maira said without blinking. That broke the dam. Tina burst out laughing, loud, sharp, and ugly. A few people in line turned to look. "Oh, honey, please," she said between giggles. "You seriously expect me to believe that? You think just slapping the name Norris on an ID makes you some kind of celebrity kid?" Maira didn't answer. Her face stayed still, but her hands clenched. Behind the counter, Tina's voice dropped low and sly. "You know what I think? I think you swiped that ticket from somebody. Or maybe you're running a scam. Kids do that. Or worse." She tilted her head. "You got something in that bag, huh? You acting all quiet, all polite, makes me nervous. Could be trying to hide something." "What?" "No," Maira started, confused. Tina didn't let her finish. She leaned closer, pretending to check the ID again, and with her other hand, subtly pressed a button under the desk. "I've seen your type," Tina said, loud enough for others to hear. Smart little girls thinking they can lie their way past real security. Maira's eyes flicked toward the corner. Two men in security uniforms had started moving her way. She looked back at Tina. "This is a mistake. I'm not lying. I can show you the email, the ticket." "Let the officers handle it, sweetie," Tina cut in, stepping back like she was suddenly scared of her. "Drug runners?" Maira's voice cracked slightly, more shocked than scared. "I'm 17. I'm just—" "Ma'am, step away from the counter," one of the security guards barked. They moved in fast, no calm talk, no asking nicely. One grabbed her backpack, the other reached for her arms. "Wait, I can explain." Maira tried, but the first guard yanked her bag out of her grip, tossing it on a table. The second grabbed her by the arm, pulling her back. She stumbled. "You haven't done anything wrong?" "You'll have your chance to explain," the taller one said, opening the backpack roughly. "Right now, we're checking for contraband." People were watching now. Phones were coming out. Someone whispered, "What's going on?" but nobody stepped forward. Inside her bag, they tore through everything: her notebook, her practice gloves, her travel-sized shampoo bottles. Her folded jeans were pulled out and dropped like a dirty towel. One agent held up a rolled-up wrist wrap and sniffed it. TSA flagged her for additional screening earlier, Tina chimed in smugly from behind the counter. "She got through, but I had a feeling. Gut instinct." Maira was silent now, her cheeks burning. But she wouldn't cry. "Not here." The agent opened a side pocket, dumping out her protein bars and some spare change. Then he turned to her again. "You're going to tell us what this is," he said, holding up a small bottle of liquid. "Muscle recovery spray," Maira said, almost a whisper. "For soreness." He looked unimpressed. "Might need to test that." She stared at him. "I'm not smuggling anything. I'm not a criminal. My dad, he'll be here. He'll explain everything." Yeah, the shorter one said, not even looking at her. "And I'm Bruce Lee." The joke landed flat, but Tina laughed again. They didn't listen. They never even gave her a chance. Maira stood there, heart pounding, breath shallow, surrounded by people who saw her as a threat, not a teenager trying to get on a plane. She was being treated like she was dangerous, all because she wore a hoodie, carried a name people didn't believe belonged to her, and kept quiet when she could have yelled. Earlier, just before things went south, her phone had buzzed in her pocket. She had stepped aside, leaned against the wall, and picked up with a small smile. "Hey, Dad." Chuck Norris's voice was soft, familiar. "You sure you don't want me to go with you, pumpkin? I could hop on the next flight, be there in 20 minutes. Maira chuckled under her breath. "Dad, if you show up at LAX, you know what happens. I'll never make it through the gate. You've got a paparazzi magnet stuck to your back." He paused, like he didn't want to agree but knew she was right. "Still, I don't like you flying alone. Not with strangers." "I'm fine," she said gently. "I need to do this alone. Just this once. Trust me." There was another pause, longer this time. "All right," Chuck finally said. "But you call me the second you land." "I mean it, Maira." "I will," she promised. "Love you. Love you more." She ended the call, slid the phone back in her pocket, and stood straighter. But now, only minutes later, she wished she had let him come. Her bag was open wide, the contents spilled out in waves, neatly folded shirts, sweatpants rolled into bundles, a pouch with toiletries, a set of practice gloves. Then, as if the universe had decided to humiliate her with surgical precision, out came a soft fabric bra, followed by 2 pairs of underwear, one plain, the other an embarrassing shade of pink she'd thrown in without thinking that morning. They hit the floor with a quiet, weightless flop. Maira's breath caught like someone had suddenly pressed against her lungs. She blinked once, then dropped to her knees without a word, hands fumbling to gather them before anyone else could see. Her fingers weren't steady. Her heart thudded inside her throat, and she could feel the burning heat crawling up the back of her neck. One pair had landed near the edge of the security rope. A man standing just outside the line glanced down, then looked away quickly, pretending not to see. Maira snatched them back, stuffing the fabric into the inner lining of her jacket. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't want to see the faces. Her fingers were still shaking when she tried to zip the side pocket closed. Behind her, another zipper opened. "Backpack too," said the second guard. "I'll open it," she said quickly, already reaching back to hand it over. But he snatched it before she could loosen the strap. It jerked off her shoulder roughly, her body pulled with it for half a second. "Please, just be careful," she tried, stepping forward as he grabbed both zippers and yanked them down in one violent motion. The contents spilled out instantly, her journal, a folded Gatorade towel, loose pens, wrapped protein bars. And at the very end, nestled deep in the bottom, a small ceramic mug, the one item she'd packed with too much care. It slid out slower than the rest, almost like it didn't want to fall. But then it did. It rolled once, then again, then it hit the tile. The sound was tiny, a soft crack at first, almost like glass under strain. And then it broke apart, splintering into a half-dozen jagged pieces that skittered across the floor, bouncing slightly before coming to a rest around her shoes. Maira stared for one beat, then two. Then her knees gave way, not from weakness, but from sheer instinct to reach. She dropped down, palms open, as if she could catch what was already lost. "No. No, no. Please, this is a keepsake from my late father." Her voice was smaller than she expected. It didn't echo like the shatter had. Behind her, one of the guards muttered, "Geez, it's just a mug." She didn't move. Her hands rested beside the pieces, her fingers curled inward like she wasn't sure whether to pick them up or bury them. Then another voice rang out, louder, coated in sweet poison. "Well, that's odd," Tina said, arms folded tightly across her chest as she leaned against the wall. "Didn't you say your dad's Chuck Norris?" Maira didn't answer. She could barely hear. Tina pushed off the wall, walking a few steps closer. "So which is it, sweetheart? Your real dad's a martial arts movie star, or some dead guy with a busted coffee mug?" Still no answer. She smirked. "Bit of a messy story, ain't it?" Something cracked. Not in the mug. In Maira. She stood. Her breath was shallow, but her eyes were steel. Her hands curled into tight fists at her side. And for the first time since she landed in this terminal, she didn't feel afraid or humiliated. She felt rage. A rage that started in her belly and pushed upward, through her ribs, through her throat, through her fists. Before the first officer realized she'd moved, her legs swung low in a clean, practiced arc. His knees buckled from under him, and he hit the ground with a heavy thud. The second lunged. She turned, used his weight against him, sent him stumbling into a stack of plastic bins near the conveyor. People gasped. Someone yelled. A woman screamed. The third man was larger. He caught her arm mid-motion, twisting it. Maira gritted her teeth and struck his side with her elbow, but his grip held. The fourth arrived from behind, hands wrapped around her waist, pulling her backward, pinning her. She kicked once, twice, but they had her, 4 grown men on one 17-year-old girl. Her arms were wrenched behind her back, legs flailing as she screamed, wordless, desperate, furious. She was no longer fighting just to get free. She was fighting to be seen. And then, like a curtain parting, the noise began to die as a calm, deep voice cut through the air. Enough. The guards froze, their breath heavy, hands still locked on her shoulders, elbows, waist. Asterisk click. Click. Click, asterisk. The sound of hard-soled shoes across tile. A man in a dark gray blazer approached with the posture of someone used to authority but not easily impressed. His eyes, gray as stone, swept across the scene, the toppled bins, the spilled clothes, the torn backpack, the broken cup, and the girl breathing like a cornered animal on the floor. Behind him stood a line of newer guards, younger, more alert, watching everything. My name is Charles, the man said. I'm the terminal supervisor. The officers stammered. One mentioned an alert. Another said she became violent. She was provoked, someone else murmured. Charles raised a hand. Silence. Then, Maira, can you stand? Her breath trembled. Her arms were still gripped by 2 officers. She didn't answer. I said, he repeated, voice firmer, let her go. Hands loosened. Maira slid forward onto her knees, then slowly pushed herself upright. Her jacket was half off her shoulder. Her shirt was damp with sweat. A smear of blood dotted her palm. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just stared. Charles looked at her, then looked down at the largest shard of the mug still lying on the floor. He knelt and picked it up. Family honor, he said quietly, split clean through. Then he straightened, met her eyes, and said, let's talk somewhere quiet. Maira nodded once and stepped over the mess, behind her, barefoot, one shoe missing, and nothing left in her bag that hadn't been broken or taken. Maira thought she was finally past the worst of it. But fate, or whatever cruel force ran airport protocol, wasn't done with her yet. Miss Norris, Charles said, motioning to a nearby service counter away from the crowd but still visible enough for a few curious onlookers to pause mid-scroll on their phones. We've had an issue come up regarding your ticket. Some irregularities that need clarification. She frowned. I already went through security. I checked in hours ago. Yes, he said, tapping a tablet. And now I'm checking your authorization to be on this flight. Business class? Yes. Flying alone. 17 years old? Yes. He swiped slowly with one finger, like he was trying to find a reason to disbelieve her. We have reason to believe this ticket was issued in error, he said after a pause. Possibly purchased fraudulently. Maira's brows knit. It wasn't. I'll need to see the credit card used, as well as identification and the device or email that shows confirmation of the booking. She opened her phone, already pulling up the message from her father, the email with her itinerary attached. My dad booked it. Chuck Norris. I have the confirmation. Charles looked up sharply. I'm sorry, did you say Chuck Norris? She nodded. He gave a short laugh, not loud, but full of disbelief. Of course, he muttered. Why not? He turned the tablet to show her the details on the booking, her name, her flight, the class of service. But the name on the card was redacted, a simple system precaution, nothing unusual. Still, he used it. "You'll understand we can't verify anything with this," he said. "I can text him. He's already on his way. He'll be here any minute." Charles exhaled like he'd heard 100 stories just like this one. "And let me guess," he said, his voice hardening with sarcasm, "he's not only Chuck Norris, but he's driving up in a blacked-out SUV with a Secret Service escort, right?" Maira blinked. She felt the weight behind his words, not just his disbelief, but the assumption. Asterisk, "You're lying. You don't belong here. You don't deserve this seat, asterisk." "I'm telling the truth," she said softly. He ignored her. One of the staff whispered something to him. Charles turned to the screen again. "I'm sorry," he said, though there was no apology in his tone. "Until we can verify full payment and identity, your boarding is denied." She stared at him. "You're canceling my ticket?" He nodded like it was nothing. "It's being held pending verification. We reserve the right to revoke access if there's concern of fraud or misrepresentation." "I'm not misrepresenting anything. I didn't steal anything. This is my name. My father, She stopped. Her hands were trembling again. "I'm not going to argue," Charles said. "If the person who paid for this ticket wants to come down and speak to us directly, we'll reconsider. Until then, please step aside." She didn't move. Charles looked at the two agents standing nearby and gave a curt nod. "Escort her out of the boarding area." "No, wait," she said, breath catching. "You can't just—" "You can call whoever you need from the public terminal," he said. "You'll need to re-enter security if the ticket's reinstated. Have a nice day." The words were like knives. She stood still as the agent stepped up, one gently motioning toward the corridor. "Let's go, Mississippi." She didn't resist, not because she agreed, but because there was nothing left in her to fight with. She walked between them, silent, every step echoing against the polished floor. Her eyes burned, not from tears, but from the sting of swallowing them. Passengers turned to watch. Some recognized her from earlier. Some whispered. Others stared at their phones, pretending they weren't watching. The corridor opened toward the baggage area. The agent beside her kept glancing ahead, walking too fast, like he wanted it over with. The others stayed quiet behind her. When they reached the glass doors near the exit, Maira finally stopped. Her knees felt weak. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out with numb fingers. The screen lit up. "Dad calling." She answered on the second ring. "Dad?" Chuck's voice was clear, low, urgent. "Maira, what's going on?" They took my ticket," she whispered, her voice breaking halfway through the sentence. "They said it was fake. They didn't believe me. They said you had to come fix it yourself." There was silence on the other end. Then, "Where are you?" "They're escorting me to baggage claim." "Stay right where you are," he said, firm, steady. Don't move. I'll be there in 10. She nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Okay. I mean it, baby girl. Don't move an inch." The call ended. She stood there, staring through the glass at the people walking by with luggage and families, at the automatic doors that opened and closed like the airport was breathing without her. The agents behind her started to walk again, but she didn't follow. She turned her back to them, leaned against the cold metal railing near the hallway wall, and sank down to sit on the tile floor. She pulled her knees up to her chest and rested her forehead against them. She didn't care who watched anymore. Let them look. Let them wonder. Let them film. She was done trying to explain herself to people who didn't want to listen. She stayed there, silent, until the sound of firm, heavy footsteps cut through the space. A hush fell over the nearby travelers. Heads turned. Phones lifted. Even the agents behind her shifted uneasily. Maira raised her head. There he was. Chuck Norris. Not in a movie. Not on TV. Here. His steps were slow, deliberate. He wore a worn gray jacket, dark jeans, and his old training shoes. Nothing flashy, no security, no cameras. But the weight of him, his presence, was loud, louder than anything else in the room. He didn't speak at first. He walked up to her and offered a hand. "You okay?" She nodded, though her eyes filled without warning. She took his hand. Then he turned to the agents behind her, and his voice was cold steel. "Someone better start talking. Right now." Chuck stood still, hands resting at his sides, but his gaze didn't move. He was looking directly at the man approaching, Charles, the terminal supervisor, who now walked with noticeably smaller steps than before. Charles had the look of a man who'd realized he'd made the kind of mistake that could end a career. His face was pale, his lips tight, his suit jacket slightly crooked like he'd rushed to put it back on. Sweat glistened just under his hairline. And when he finally came to a stop in front of Chuck, his hand trembled slightly as he extended it. "Mr. Norris, sir, I can't tell you how sorry I am about what happened here today." Chuck didn't take his hand. He just looked at it, then raised his eyes back up to Charles's face. "You're the one who pulled her ticket." Charles swallowed visibly. "Yes, sir. I received an alert from our system, and I acted according to policy. But clearly, I should have looked deeper." "Policy," Chuck repeated quietly. Was humiliating a 17-year-old girl policy? Charles's voice cracked. "Sir, no, absolutely not. I mean, I didn't realize, I wasn't told she was your..." Chuck stepped forward, not fast, just one quiet step, and Charles instinctively stepped back. "She told you who she was," Chuck said, his voice low but cutting clean through every noise in the terminal. "She showed you her ID, her boarding pass, her name. All you saw was someone who didn't fit your picture of who should be flying in business class." I admit I made assumptions," Charles said, almost a whisper now. "Terrible assumptions. I regret them deeply. And I'm going to personally see to it that this never happens again. I already instructed our team to reinstate her ticket, sir. And we'll upgrade her if needed. And I'll speak to the entire floor staff about the incident." Chuck didn't blink. "Is her name on the ticket?" "Yes, sir." "Absolutely." "Who paid for it?" "Your name, sir. It's on the original purchase record. We failed to verify it properly." Chuck's eyes narrowed just slightly. "You didn't fail to verify. You failed to respect her." Charles nodded quickly, like a man hanging onto a rope that was fraying fast. "You're absolutely right. That's on me. All of it. I've already informed upper management. I'll file the report myself, take full accountability." "Is that before or after the videos get posted?" Chuck asked quietly, casting a glance around at the small crowd nearby, half of them holding phones, pretending to text but clearly filming everything. Charles paled further. "We'll handle it. I mean, we'll reach out to media if necessary. We'll issue a formal statement. We'll clear the record." Chuck raised an eyebrow. "I'm not here for statements." Charles's voice dropped, almost pleading. "Mr. Norris, please, if there's anything else we can do to make this right, I'm at your full disposal. I'll personally walk your daughter through security. I'll stay with her at the gate. I'll file disciplinary reports, whatever you need." Chuck turned slightly, glancing at Maira, who stood a few feet behind, still shaken but watching every word. The room had quieted some by the time the next man walked in. He wasn't tall, didn't carry the weight of fame or muscle like Chuck, but the moment he stepped up, everyone made room. He wore a blazer that didn't look expensive but was well cared for, and his shoes tapped the floor in a steady rhythm that said he wasn't there to waste time. His name badge read, Sir Henson, Regional Director. He came straight toward Chuck Norris, stopped at a respectful distance, and spoke with the kind of calm that made the chaos shrink a little. "Mr. Norris, I'm terribly sorry about what's happened here today." Chuck didn't speak right away. Sir Henson glanced at Maira, then back to him. "We've reviewed what occurred. I've already spoken with Charles and our other staff. There were failures across the board, judgment, procedure, and, more importantly, human decency. Chuck gave a slow nod. "You're not wrong. I appreciate you not walking out," Henson said. "And I appreciate the way you've handled this, especially with how public it's become." Chuck's voice was low. "We don't want attention. We just wanted to board the flight." "I understand," Henson said. "I've already revalidated your daughter's ticket, same seat, same class. She's also been added to our priority clearance for the remainder of the day. No more gate trouble. No more random checks." Chuck looked over at Maira. She stood quietly, her hands still tucked into the sleeves of her hoodie. She'd been silent since the last exchange. Her eyes had that distant look again, one foot still back in that moment when the cup broke, when people laughed, when they didn't believe her. "She'll be escorted to the plane through a secure lane," Henson continued. "And I'll personally walk you both to the terminal entrance, if that's all right." Chuck nodded again. "That'll do." The other airport staff stood farther off now, none of them saying a word. A few avoided eye contact. Some were clearly watching the growing crowd behind the glass, travelers filming, whispering, eyes wide. They knew they were part of a moment that wasn't going to disappear quietly. Chuck turned his head, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel under it. "Your people need to remember something." Henson waited. "My daughter wasn't asking for a favor. She wasn't trying to cheat the system. She walked in here with her own name, her own story, and a valid ticket. And what she got in return was suspicion, mockery, and a level of treatment no one should accept. Not her. Not anyone." "You're absolutely right," Henson replied, his voice steady. "And it's our job now to make sure it never happens again. I'll be speaking with corporate. There will be training. And consequences." Chuck didn't nod this time. He just looked at the man and let the silence speak. Then he turned to Maira. She'd been holding herself together for nearly 2 hours, through the stares, the broken mug, the interrogation, the fight to be believed. She looked up at him now, trying to read his face. "Ready to go?" he asked. She nodded, but not with much energy. "Yeah." Henson motioned to the staff member who guided them to the far lane marked priority access only. The crowd shifted again as they moved, phones lowered, whispers continued. Maira walked just behind her dad, one hand still clutching the torn strap of her backpack. She didn't look left or right, just forward, through the glass, through the metal detectors, past the agents who now greeted her with quiet, nervous nods. She was back in control. But only just. Inside the final security line, where it was quieter and warmer, Chuck turned to her. "You did good." She smiled a little, but it didn't last. "Still feels bad," she admitted. "I know it's over, but—" "You let it get to you," she said. "I lost it back there." "You didn't lose it," Chuck said. "You were pushed. But I shouldn't have let them see how much it hurt." Chuck looked her in the eyes. "That's not weakness, Maira. That's being human. Anyone who thinks they get to push people around just because they're in uniform or behind a desk, they're the ones who should be ashamed." She didn't answer, but her shoulders relaxed just slightly. The boarding door was still open when Chuck looked down at Maira and made his decision. "I'm coming with you." She blinked, surprised. "You don't have to. I can still go alone." Chuck shook his head. "After today, you're not getting on that plane without me sitting right beside you." There was no room for argument in his voice, not because he was mad, not because he didn't trust her. Just the opposite. But after what she'd been through, the way they'd looked at her, talked to her, touched her things, he couldn't let her fly off into that sky with hands still trembling and a heart full of broken glass. He stepped over to the gate agent. One look. One quiet conversation. And a seat was found. Things like that happen when your name still carried weight. They boarded quietly, slipping into their row near the front of the plane. Most passengers were already buckled in, distracted by their own worries. A few looked over, some with curiosity, some with phones halfway raised. But Chuck ignored them. He placed his bag under the seat, helped Maira with hers, and then sat back as the cabin doors clicked shut. The hum of the plane filled the silence. Maira sat by the window, arms crossed tight against her chest. She didn't cry. She didn't talk. She just stared at the patch of sky she could see through the smudged glass. On her lap was a small white towel, folded and cradled carefully in both hands. Inside it, wrapped in tissue, were the broken pieces of the mug. She hadn't let go of it since they left the terminal. Chuck watched her for a moment before speaking. "You going to hold on to those the whole flight?" She didn't look at him. "Yeah." He leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Let me see your hands." "I'm fine." "Let me see." She hesitated, then slowly unfolded her fingers. The cuts weren't deep, but there were several thin red lines across her palm, one still bleeding slightly at the base of her thumb. Chuck didn't say anything. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a clean handkerchief, the same old one he always kept, the corners fraying just a little. He took her hand without asking and began cleaning the blood, soft and slow, like it hurt him more than it hurt her. She watched him, eyes burning. "You should have let them help you," he said quietly. "They didn't care," she whispered. "They just threw it." Chuck didn't answer right away. He folded the cloth over, kept wiping. His touch never rushed, never rough. Maira's fingers started to relax. When he finished, he held her hand for a moment longer. "You know," he said, eyes still on her skin, "you remind me so much of him." She looked over, confused. "Your dad." She swallowed. Chuck sat back in his seat, hand resting on his knee. Now, voice low, he had a way about him. Quiet. Always thinking, always watching. Wouldn't speak unless it mattered. But when he did talk, folks listened. Maira stayed silent. He was stubborn, too. You'd argue with him till your face turned blue, and he still wouldn't budge. Had that fire in his chest, just like you. But he didn't use it to pick fights. He used it to stand up for other people. Mostly, he couldn't look the other way when something was wrong. Maira blinked slowly. Chuck continued. "There was this fire, a few years before you were born. Apartment building downtown. Late night. Whole place going up like matchwood. Fire trucks were late. People were screaming from the windows." He paused. "And your dad, he just ran in." Her eyes widened. Didn't wait for permission. Didn't stop to think. Just heard there were people inside and took off through the smoke. Chuck's voice grew quiet. "He got 4 folks out. A mom and her baby. 2 older men who couldn't walk too well. He carried them, one after the other." Maira covered her mouth with one hand. Chuck looked out the window now. But by the time he went back for the 5th, the roof gave. Maira pressed her eyes shut. Chuck nodded slowly, his face calm but distant. "He didn't make it. But those people did. And that's the man who raised you. That's the blood you carry." The silence between them filled up like a balloon too full of feeling. Maira looked down at the pieces in her lap, small, sharp, useless now. Then she looked at her hand, wrapped neatly in the handkerchief. Then at Chuck. She didn't speak. She just leaned over and wrapped her arms around him. It wasn't careful. It wasn't neat. She just folded herself into him like she was finally done holding up the weight of the day. Her shoulders shook. Her breath hitched. Chuck held her, one arm firm around her back, one hand resting on the back of her head. He didn't say anything at first. He just let her cry. And when the tears slowed, when the shaking turned into quiet breathing, she whispered, "Thank you. For coming. For staying. For not walking away." He kissed the top of her head. "I'm not going anywhere." She pulled back slightly, eyes red. "I'm sorry if I made trouble." Chuck looked her in the eye. "You didn't make trouble. You were in trouble. And you stood your ground." She tried to smile. "It didn't quite make it. I know I'm not your real." Chuck shook his head, cutting her off. "You are," he said. "Don't ever finish that sentence. You are my daughter. In every way that matters." Her face broke then. He pulled her back in, resting his chin gently on her hair. "To me," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "you've always been that little girl I held the first time your mom let me try. The one who used to run out barefoot to hand me water after practice. The one who stared down the neighbor's pit bull at age 5 like it was nothing." She laughed through the tears. "I remember that. You looked him dead in the eyes," Chuck chuckled. "Dog walked away like he was scared." She laughed again, harder this time, and wiped her cheeks with the side of her sleeve. Chuck leaned back and looked at her, serious again. "You're strong, Maira. Not because you fight, but because you know why you fight. And you don't back down when you know you're right." She nodded. The plane began to hum louder as the engine roared to life. The wheels bumped forward. Chuck looked down at the bundle in her lap. "Keep the pieces," he said. "It's okay if it's broken. Sometimes, broken things are the ones that remind us what really matters." She didn't answer. She just reached over and held his hand. And this time, she didn't let go. And there you have it, folks. That was Maira Norris, the girl who carried more than just a name. This story isn't just about airports or security or even celebrity names. It's about dignity, about what it feels like to be young and judged, to carry something precious like a memory or a name and have it dismissed, even destroyed, and then to have someone stand up for you, not with fists, not with threats, but with quiet, unwavering love. Chuck Norris didn't show up with fame blazing or power flashing. He showed up as a father, a protector, a man who understood that strength isn't in how loud you shout, but in how steady you stand. And let's be honest, how can you not admire that? His calm authority, his fierce loyalty, the way he wiped his daughter's wounds and told her she was his, not because of blood, but because of heart. That's the kind of love this world needs more of. And Maira? She didn't just survive that day. She stood her ground. And in the end, she walked forward, not in anyone's shadow, but in her own strength. If this story moved you like it moved me, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment down below. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like, share, and hit that subscribe button for more heartfelt stories like this. Until next time, be kind, stand tall, and remember, broken things still carry meaning. Just like Maira's cup.